have you looked at the adverse effects as opposed to the people that are involved in the project against people that are not involved in the project, and see if there's any correlation? I mean, I just throw that out.
No, I understand the question, and that's the type of question that we'd like to be able to ask with what I would refer to as systematic studies. So, you'd like to be able to go into an area and ask everyone to tell you what their experience has been. In fact, better still, you'd like to be able to go in before the installation and ask them about their health, and then go in after. And we're trying to work on putting some of those together. I wish we had them for years, but we didn't. And yes, that would be pretty interesting to know. Now, my observation is that relatively few of the self-reported pieces of data like I've described here come from people who were involved in the project. Now, oftentimes I've heard that I'm not involved in the legal side of this at all, but oftentimes I've heard that people who are financially involved in the project sign contracts saying that they won't talk about it. I don't know how often that occurs. I don't know how binding those are. I'm not a legal expert, but that's the explanation that's often offered for why you don't see many such stories, if you will. You do see some, though. It's definitely not none.
Any other questions?
Has there been any other explanation then as to what may cause this, the vibration, the air turbulence, or?
So you heard my explanation, which it has to do with a constant minor tweaking of that fight or flight reaction, which produces a steroid reaction in the body that causes all sorts of stress. Others are more convinced that it has to do with the effects on the direct effects on the vestibular system, that is the balance system, that the low frequency sound creates a constant sense of being a little bit off balance, which causes a lot of these problems. I think of an illness as a seasickness, motion sickness type of problem from what happens in the inner ear and also in the chest due to the sound effects. There are others who have different views. I think the two I just described are the dominant ones, although there are a handful of other explanations that I don't think stand up to scrutiny. Now, if somebody came in and insisted to me that neither of those explanations is right, here's my proof for why this explanation doesn't explain it. Here's my proof for why that explanation doesn't explain it. Now that would be quite a mystery. It would be a very interesting medical mystery, but it wouldn't change the evidence we have that there actually are these outcomes. I mean, that's why ultimately I look to the epidemiology, why ultimately I'm an epidemiologist, because I want to see what's actually happening to people, and if you can't tell me why, that's a mystery, but I still see it happening.
Any other?
So you had mentioned, maybe I misunderstood you, that roughly 5% of the people that live within a mile are affected. Is that?
Are substantially affected.
Substantially.
Yeah, that's my best guess based on what I've been able to piece together. And if you were to insist to me that it was 3%, or to insist to me that it was 8%, I couldn't tell you were wrong. Now, if you were to insist to me that it was only 1% or that it was more than 10%, I'd say I think you're on shaky ground there. So you can see that there is legitimate scientific uncertainty here, but it doesn't mean the whole world is a possibility. It just means that we're not sure by a range of double or triple, which isn't very comforting from a scientific perspective, but it does tell us quite a lot.
And there's no, it affects some people and it doesn't affect other people.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. There are, perhaps half, based on some of the more systematic studies, half the people who don't seem to have any problem at all. I mean, they might have aesthetic complaints about the noise or something like that. They might find that it's invasive, that they used to like to sit out in their backyard, and now they don't anymore because of the noise, but they don't report insomnia or headaches or any of these other problems. And sort of the other half are an issue of degree. It's sort of arbitrary where you draw the line about where health impact, of course, starts, right? And so, a single noise that wakes you up in the middle of the night, is certainly nothing that you want to have happening, but you wouldn't suggest there was a health impact. On the other hand, sort of a constant irritation that wakes you up 100 times at night, over and over again, night after night, clearly is a health impact. There's no bright line in between those, unfortunately, to define it.
What are the 5 diseases?
I was talking casually when I said 5, but the diseases that show up over and over again are sleep disorders, and sort of a general technical term that mostly refers to problems with insomnia. Fatigue, which might be secondary to the insomnia, obviously, or might be a separate problem of its own. Difficulty concentrating, same issue. Sleep problems can explain both of those. Mood disorders, and that's sort of a fancy way of saying people become touchy, quick to anger. They get in fights where it never happened before. Children suddenly become, have fist fights in their classroom. Families argue with each other in ways. Again, that's a very typical reaction to chronic stress. I mean, we all know that. Stress in a household leads to more fights. From a technical medical perspective, that is a very serious disorder, a mood disorder. Headaches show up. Again, they could be caused by insomnia, they could be caused by the fights, or they could be an effect coming from a completely different pathway. Those tend to be the dominant ones that show up in the pattern. But there were also these vestibular balance problems where many people actually report feeling off balance a lot, which is one of the observations that supports the hypothesis that that's the pathway that is responsible for a lot of this. And many people report ringing in their ears or other auditory problems, which again supports those theories that have to do with the ears rather than the psyche.
So your comment is now about 5% of the people inside a mile are affected. In public policy, which you said you've done work on, what's allowable for the net effect of the population. What would that number be?
Well, I mean that's why I was sort of referring to this unfortunately fictitious analysis, the one where some people sit down and honestly, seriously try to figure out what the benefits of this are. So you can imagine if without these wind turbines, the lights were going to go out on all of us. This is the difference between having a functioning electric grid or not. We'd be willing to pay a pretty high price to have that happen. So what good is it to have these rather than having more natural gas burning, which is basically the direct substitute? Nobody's sort of laid that out. So if there isn't much of an advantage at all, I would have to come back and say, how dare we impose this hit on innocent bystanders for something that doesn't actually seem to be producing much net value for society. So I'd like to see that analysis, and I certainly haven't done it, and neither has anyone else. If we were going to build a roadway and we estimated that 5% of the people driving on it were going to suffer some sort of accident, that would obviously be too high. On the other hand, we know that 5% of all of us are going to suffer some injury in a car accident during our lives, but we consider that to be a price worth paying for the totality of road transportation. So, it depends on the benefits to balance against the costs.
Any other questions or comments, sir? If not, are there any comments or questions from anyone in the audience? Please state your name, sir.
Richard Boris, Village of Lee. If we take the premise that the confidentiality clauses in contracts that farmers sign and other good neighbor policies actually suppresses the percolating up of health issues, then the numbers of health issues are actually underreported if you follow that premise. Would you agree?
Yes, certainly. Well, in fact, even apart from that, we know that the number of health issues are underreported because, of course, not everyone who suffers these problems has the time or energy or inclination to proactively report them to us, even if there's nothing forbidding them from doing so. So the fact that we have thousands of these, I mean, if we were confident somehow, imagine a world where we were confident that only those cases that have been reported, that's all of the problems out there. Well, then we might be saying, well, yeah, there clearly are problems, but the numbers are low. But with adverse event reporting, the FDA typically makes estimates in the order of 50-fold. That is, for every one report they get, there are 50 of them out there. I don't believe the ratio is nearly that high in this case, but there is a big multiplier there between people who report and others who suffer but don't report.
Another question relative to quality of life. This was asked by a young lady at the Village of Lee hearing, but there wasn't a satisfactory answer from the wind turbine company. I know a number of farmers who are hearing impaired, and some have hearing aids and some don't. It seems the sound would have an adverse effect on their quality of life in their communication with others and hearing of other things. Has there been any studies in those directions?
Not that I know of. That's a really good question. I hadn't actually thought about that before. I suspect that some of the more general research on noise and health, which exists for other sources of noise, might lend some information about that. I haven't looked into it, but yeah, it's certainly plausible. The nature of hearing aids altering how we hear things might matter. And it's possible that people who are hearing impaired might have a lot less problem because they aren't actually getting some of the signal that disturbs other people, or it might be that the signal that is disturbing are these infrasound, these very low frequency sounds that you detect through other parts of your body and not your ear. But how it affects someone with a hearing aid is kind of an interesting question, and I have no idea.
Thank you.
Dick Bender from Compton. If you live within a mile of one turbine, how do the effects change if you live within a mile of 5 turbines?
Yeah. Five is a lot, certainly, and you might, you have 10, okay.
I mean, did the number of incidents, the number of reports increase, and does the severity increase?
We would certainly predict that, but the biggest prediction is that you would experience the impact more often rather than necessarily it being additive. That is, well, first off, I don't think we have the data on that. That is, the mining of the adverse event reports and so forth, I don't think shows any clear pattern about the numbers, although we can certainly predict which way it would go. But one thing that is quite clear from them is that people report that, well, we have one turbine this direction from us, and when the wind is blowing this way, it's no problem, and when the wind's blowing that way, it's a big problem. And that's very common. I mean, it's perfectly predictable about how the noise transmits. And so with 5 of them in 5 different directions, we would expect that given that observed pattern, approximately 5 times as often would you be feeling the impact, even if it didn't necessarily add to the magnitude. But unfortunately, that's another case where we don't have the data to actually show that that's happening. That's a purely prediction.
Thank you.
Could you use the mic, please?